Let's talk about a very specific piece of plastic, the Nintendo GameCube. For a lot of people, that little purple lunchbox was purely a Mario or Zelda machine, but honestly, the jump to 3D Mario just wasn't grabbing my attention the same way as the classic Super Nintendo days did. I essentially bought that console for one very specific reason, and that reason was Capcom getting the Resident Evil remake, and Resident Evil 0 made the hardware investment totally worth it in my eyes. But nothing could have prepared me for what was hiding on a random promotional demo disc. I remember putting that disc in, completely unaware of what I was about to watch. It wasn't even a playable demo, it was just a video trailer, but those few minutes of footage absolutely blew my mind and changed the entire perspective on what a video game could actually look like. The screen opens up on this dreary, washed out, incredibly hostile European village, and then the enemies showed up, but they weren't the slow, shuffling Romero style zombies we had spent the last decade dodging in narrow hallways. These people were fast, they were organised, and they were droning in towards the camera with pure, aggressive mob mentality. They were carrying pitchforks, waving flaming torches, and violently throwing axes right at the screen. You could see they had wooden shields to block bullets, and the footage even teased chaotic, massive shootouts with heavy Gatling guns later down the line. It was pure, adrenaline-fueled action on a scale the franchise had never even attempted before. And right in the middle of this absolute nightmare was Leon S. Kennedy. My favourite character from Resident Evil 2 was finally getting an official, canonical return, but he wasn't the terrified rookie cop struggling to survive the first day on the job anymore. He was a highly trained government agent, diving through windows, kicking ladders off roofs, and roundhouse kicking angry villagers in the jaw. He was completely unreal. Watching that trailer was a surreal experience. It entirely validated buying the GameCube, but beneath all that overwhelming hype and the sheer graphical leap, there was a very clear message being broadcast. The old rules were dead, the board was being wiped clean, and the gaming industry was about to change forever.
Americano, see? Now what brings a bloke like you to this part of the world? Oh, hey, easy, whoever you are.
Name's Leon. Came here looking for this girl.
By the time the early 2000s rolled around, it felt like the Resident Evil franchise was completely running out of steam. Capcom knew the classic survival horror formula was showing its age, and in a desperate attempt to keep things fresh, they started throwing absolutely every gimmick they could think of at the wall. We had the awkward partner-swapping prequel of Resident Evil 0, we had the first-person arcade shooters, weird handheld ports, and as we've already covered, the incredible messy attempt at online multiplayer with the Outbreak games. Even with the absolute masterpiece that was the 2002 remake, it was clear that the core mechanics of the series had hit a ceiling. The tank was running on fumes. Getting to the next mainline numbered entry was an absolute nightmare behind the scenes. Shinji Mikami eventually had to step back into the director's chair to save the project, but the path to the final game was paved with scrapped ideas. They went through multiple massive development resets. At one point, they were working on a paranormal, psychological version known as the Hookman build. Before that, they had an action-heavy prototype directed by Hideki Kamiya that strayed so far from the horror roots that Capcom just spun it off into an entirely new franchise, accidentally inventing Devil May Cry. After years of hitting dead ends, Mikami realised that slightly tweaking the old formula just wasn't going to cut it anymore. They couldn't just add a new coat of paint to Raccoon City. To save the franchise, they had to completely wipe the board clean. They threw out the pre-rendered backgrounds, they threw out the fixed camera angles, they even threw out the traditional zombies and the Umbrella Corporation itself. It was an incredibly massive risk to take a beloved established franchise and completely reboot its gameplay identity from the ground up, but they started completely fresh with a whole new mindset, and as history shows, they absolutely knocked it out the park.
I received special training via a secret organization working under the direct control of the president. I was to assume the responsibility of protecting the new president's family.
Cornel, why am I the one who always gets the short end of the stick?
Yo, who are you really? Come on and tell us. You are a long way from home, cowboy.
When the dust finally settled on Raccoon City back in 1998, we were left with a handful of survivors heading off into an uncertain future. For a lot of us, Leon S. Kennedy was the absolute standout. He wasn't a highly trained member of stars like Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. He was just a rookie cop who happened to have the worst first day at work in human history. We spent hours guiding him through the hallways of the RPD, watching him get manipulated by Ada Wong, and genuinely rooting for the guy to just catch a break. But after Resident Evil 2, Leon basically vanished from the mainline games. We got Code Veronica, we got the prequels, we got the endless spin-offs, but the guy who actually managed to blow up the underground lab and escape the train was completely sidelined. So when it was finally confirmed that he was the undisputed leading man for Resident Evil 4, the nostalgia hit incredibly hard. My favourite character was finally getting his official canonical return, except the guy who stepped out of that police car in rural Spain wasn't the same terrified rookie we remembered. The floppy hair was still there, and that iconic brown bomber jacket made an incredible first impression, but his entire personality had undergone a massive overhaul. 6 years had passed in the timeline, and Leon had been recruited directly by the US government. He wasn't surviving by the skin of his teeth anymore. He was a highly trained elite special agent sent on a solo mission to rescue the president's daughter. The new Leon was brimming with an almost ridiculous level of confidence. The contrast was staggering. Instead of cautiously checking the corners of the police station, hoping not to find a liquor, he was casually kicking open cabin doors and roundhouse kicking hostile villagers in the jaw. He had suddenly transformed into an action movie star, complete with the ability to dive through second-story windows and deliver some of the most incredibly cheesy B-movie one-liners ever written into a video game. He went from desperately trying to find the precinct armory to casually asking a mob of pitchfork-wielding locals if everyone was going to bingo. It was a jarring transition at first, but it worked perfectly for the exact direction the franchise was taking. The classic survival horror of the PS1 era was all about feeling helpless and outmatched by your environment. Resident Evil 4 completely flipped that dynamic. You weren't a helpless victim anymore. You were playing as a one-man army, and Leon's newfound swagger perfectly matched the adrenaline-fueled gameplay that was about to unfold. He was back, and he was better than ever, and he was exactly the anchor we needed to ground this wild new era of the franchise. When you actually sat down and took control of Leon for the first time, the sheer magnitude of what Capcom had done became instantly apparent. For almost a decade, the entire identity of survival horror was built on fixed camera angles. You walked into a room, the perspective shifted to a dramatic, pre-rendered corner of the ceiling, and you essentially steered your character like a tank, hoping you didn't accidentally walk directly into the waiting arms of an off-screen zombie. It was notoriously clunky, but it manufactured a very specific, restrictive type of dread. Resident Evil 4 took that entire philosophy, dragged it out back, and put it out of its misery. Instead of watching Leon from a CCTV camera, the perspective was pulled right in tight, hovering just over his right shoulder. It sounds like such a basic, standard concept now, but in the mid-2000s, this was a massive revelation. It completely shattered the boundary between the player and the environment. You were no longer just observing the horror from afar. You were thrust directly into the middle of the mud and the blood. Every major third-person action game that followed, from Gears of War to Dead Space to The Last of Us, owes its entire mechanical foundation to what Shinji Mikami built right here. But the camera was only half of the revolution. The real genius was the combat loop. The game ditched the traditional auto-aim system for a brilliant precise laser sight. When you drew your weapon, the camera zoomed in just a little closer, planting Leon's feet firmly to the ground, and a bright red beam cut through the dreary Spanish fog. This completely changed the economy of combat. You weren't just firing blindly down a hallway hoping to hit center mass anymore. You were actively targeting specific body parts to control an aggressive crowd. You could shoot a charging villager in the kneecap to drop them to the floor, or shoot a throwing axe right out of the air before it hit your face. And that precision opened up the most addictive mechanic in the history of the franchise, the context-sensitive melee attack. You pop a Granado in the face with the handgun, they stagger backwards clutching their eyes, and a button prompt flashes on the screen. You sprint in, hit the button, and Leon delivers a devastating, crowd cheering roundhouse kick that sends 3 enemies flying into the dirt. Later on, you are literally suplexing cultists so hard their heads shatter. It was a fluid, aggressive dance of crowd control that made you feel incredibly dangerous. It wasn't just about barely surviving the encounter anymore, it was about completely dominating the room. But amidst all that adrenaline and the thrill of mastering the new combat loop, there was a very distinct, bittersweet realisation setting in. Once the initial shock of the village wore off, you couldn't help but look around and notice exactly what had been sacrificed to make this over-the-shoulder revolution possible. For years, the entire identity of this franchise was tied to a very specific gothic aesthetic. We grew up exploring the claustrophobic, pre-rendered hallways of the Spencer Mansion and the desolate, rain-slicked streets of Raccoon City. There was a quiet, suffocating dread to those environments. You were forced to navigate them slowly, fighting the deliberate, heavy tank controls that made every single step feel like a massive commitment. And then there were the doors, those incredibly slow, first-person loading screens where a rusted metal handle would slowly turn in the pitch black. It was technically just a hardware limitation, but it accidentally became the greatest tension-building tool in gaming history. You never knew what was waiting on the other side, and the game forced you to sit in that anxiety for 5 agonising seconds. Resident Evil 4 stripped all of that away. The pre-rendered artistry was replaced by fully 3D, dreary, mud-soaked environments. The quiet isolation was replaced by constant, chaotic shouting of angry locals. The creeping dread of the unknown was completely overwritten by pure, relentless action. It left a profound feeling of uncertainty. On one hand, there was no denying that this game was an absolute masterpiece. It was a massive necessary push forward for a series that had clearly run out of ideas and was drowning in awkward spin-offs. They took the absolute biggest risk possible, completely wiping the board clean, and they undeniably struck gold. But on the other hand, it just didn't feel like my beloved Resident Evil anymore. The second game will probably always be my absolute favourite. It just caught me at the exact right age to leave a permanent mark on what I believe survival horror should be. Playing the fourth game was like playing a completely different franchise that just happened to be wearing Leon Kennedy's face. It was an incredible, adrenaline-filled experience unlike anything else on the market, but it came with a heavy, undeniable realisation that all the classic elements that made the series what it was were gone for good. We were never going to see that old style again. If there is one single sequence that perfectly encapsulates why Resident Evil 4 changed the entire gaming landscape, it is the village square. You walk down a muddy path, pull out your binoculars and look down the dreary, washed out settlement. You see a police officer, one of the guys who drove you there, being burnt alive on a massive bonfire while the locals casually go about their day. It is a deeply unsettling setup. And then you step into the village, you take a few steps forward, a woman spots you, points a finger and screams, "On for esto!" Suddenly, the entire dynamic of the game shatters. In any classic Resident Evil, a game of enemies this large would be a slow, manageable puzzle. You would kite them around a table or just run past them while they moaned and shuffled. But here, they immediately organise. They start flanking you, they throw axes, They wield pitchforks and they sprint at you with absolute relentless aggression. It introduces a level of pure, unadulterated panic that the series had never achieved before. You instantly recognise that if you stand still, you are going to die. You have to move. You are vaulting over wooden fences, shooting enemies in the knees to clear a path, and desperately scrounging for ammo in random wooden barrels. Eventually, sheer desperation forces you into the nearest two-storey house. The second you cross the threshold, a cutscene triggers, and Leon slams the door shut. The game officially introduces the barricade mechanic. You push a heavy wooden bookshelf in front of the door, completely blocking the entrance. For a split second, you think you're safe. You run upstairs, grab the shotgun off the wall, and take a breath. And then you hear it. The low, mechanical rumble of a two-stroke engine, the chainsaw revs up, cutting through the shouting of the mob outside. A man with a burlap sack over his head starts carving his way through the wooden door you just barricaded. Dr. Salvador isn't just a tough enemy, he is a walking, one-hit kill executioner. If he gets close to you, your head comes off. It is an absolute masterclass in escalating tension. You are shooting down the stairs, pushing ladders off the second-storey windows to stop the villagers climbing up, and completely fighting for your life. Just when you think you are completely out of ammo and about to be overwhelmed, the village bell tolls, the chainsaw stops, the villagers drop their weapons, turn their backs on you, and slowly shamble towards the church like nothing ever happened, leaving Leon standing alone in the mud to deliver that legendary bingo line. It is without exaggeration one of the greatest opening levels in video game history.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
The actual enemies in this game were probably the biggest pill for me to swallow. From the moment you step into the village, it becomes immediately clear that the classic shuffling undead are completely gone. We traded the T-virus for the Las Plagas parasite, and we traded the mindless groaning corpses for Granados. From a pure gameplay perspective, the Granados were an absolute triumph of game design. They were terrifying in a completely new way. They weren't scary because they were going to slowly corner you in a tight hallway. They were scary because they could think. They communicated with each other in Spanish. They set up ambushes. They flanked your position, and they actively dodged your laser sight. If you aimed at their heads, they wouldn't duck. If you locked yourself in a room, they would just break the windows and throw dynamite inside. They brought a level of dynamic, unpredictable threat that the combat loop desperately needed to function. But honestly, even as a kid, while I was having the absolute time of my life fighting them off, a part of me was genuinely gutted. I wanted a zombie game. It sounds so simple, but that was the core appeal of the franchise for me. The slow, relentless, overwhelming tide of the undead was always my favourite type of supernatural creature, spanning all the way from classic movies to video games. It was the entire foundation for my love of the horror genre. We literally used to run around the playground cosplaying as survivors, doing the slow zombie shuffle and pretending to barricade the climbing frame. That specific creep and dread was what made Resident Evil special to me. Losing the zombies felt like losing the soul of the series. The Granados were fantastic enemies, but they felt like they belonged in a completely different genre. When you strip away the undead and replace them with angry villagers wielding pitchforks and driving trucks, you cross a very specific line. You move away from classic survival horror and plant your flag firmly in the territory of a blockbuster action movie. As amazing as the moment-to-moment gameplay was, you could already see that the deliberate balance between old-school horror and modern action was starting to tip. It wasn't entirely the right move for the long-term atmosphere of the franchise, even if it made for a flawlessly fun video game in the moment.
Got something that might interest you.
Seeing a blue flame in the distance completely rewired how my brain processed safety in this franchise. The traditional save room, a quiet enclosed space with a typewriter and a magical interconnected item box was iconic, but taking that concept and turning it into a travelling, heavily armed capitalist in a trench coat was pure genius. The Merchant is easily one of the greatest NPC additions in gaming history. You could be running for your life from a mob of pitchfork-wielding villagers, desperately out of shotgun shells, and then you'd turn the corner, see that glowing purple blue torch, and hear that raspy, incredible comforting voice, "What are you buying?" He wasn't just a shop, he was the gateway to the greatest inventory system ever designed, the attaché case. Capcom somehow managed to take the mundane chore of menu management and turn it into a highly addictive, spatial puzzle game. You were no longer just moving text blocks from your pockets into an endless magical chest. You were physically organising your briefcase like a violent game of Tetris. There was a genuine, undeniable dopamine rush in spending 20 minutes rotating a handgun, a first aid spray, and 3 boxes of sniper ammo just to perfectly fit a freshly purchased riot gun in the bottom corner. If a single brown egg was out of place, the entire ecosystem collapsed. It was deeply satisfying in a way that is honestly hard to explain to anyone who hasn't sat there obsessively rotating a fish just to make sure there's room for a flash grenade. This spatial economy completely changed how you interacted with the environment. In the older games, you only picked up items you absolutely needed to survive because your slots were so heavily restricted. Here, you were an absolute scavenger. You were shooting crows out of the sky for loose change, keeping an eye out for shiny spinels hidden in the mud, and carefully combining gemstones with dirty brass pocket watches just to squeeze a few extra pesetas out of the merchant. It created this brilliant constant loop of risk and reward. Do you spend your hard-earned cash on a larger attaché case so you can hoard more healing items? Or do you sink those funds into upgrading the firepower and the reload speed of your starting pistol? Every single purchase felt like a massive tactical decision. The merchant wasn't just selling weapons, he was selling the illusion of controlling a game that was constantly trying to overwhelm you.
Got some rare things on. What are you buying? Is that all? Thank you.
The roster of characters surrounding Leon is where the game fully embraces its new blockbuster identity. Seeing Ada Wong grapple into the frame wearing a red cocktail dress was a massive moment. We hadn't properly seen her since she supposedly fell to her death in Resident Evil 2. Aside from mysteriously dropping that rocket launcher for us to finish off the Tyrant, and her quick text cameo in the Resident Evil 3 epilogue, her dynamic with Leon was still perfectly intact, constantly playing him while working on her own mysterious angle, and pulling the strings from the shadows, of course, was Albert Wesker, serving as a quiet reminder that the overarching lore of the franchise was still ticking away in the background. Then you throw Jack Krauser into the mix. Suddenly, Leon has a bitter, beret-wearing ex-military rival, leading to that notoriously stressful, heavily coordinated knife fight QTE. It was pure, unapologetic action movie stuff. On the flip side of the tension, we had Louis Serret, the suave, slightly sleazy researcher, who served as the perfect charismatic foil to Leon's newfound stoic one-liner persona. But the absolute peak of this new direction was the villains themselves. The horror of the classic games relied heavily on the silent, looming threats like Nemesis or the Tyrant just relentlessly stalking you through the hallways. Resident Evil 4 took the completely opposite approach. Lord Sadler, Raymond Salazar and Chief Mendez, affectionately dubbed the Big Cheese, were pure, unadulterated B-movie camp. They didn't just stalk you, they actively called your radio frequency just to dramatically monologue at you and lay out their evil plans. Leon casually bantering with an ancient-looking, pint-sized aristocrat in a Napoleon hat while trapped in a sprawling Gothic castle is completely absurd on paper, but it kinda works. The sheer confidence of the writing carries the entire experience. The game knows exactly how ridiculous it is, and it leans all the way in, letting Leon actively mock the villains to their faces. It's a massive departure from the terrifying, isolated dread of the Spencer Mansion, but this bizarre, highly memorable cast of heroes and villains is exactly what cemented the game's legendary pop culture status.
Cliché that only happens in your Hollywood movies. Oh, Mr. Kennedy, you entertain me. To show my appreciation, I will help you awaken from your world of clichés. Escort
missions are universally recognised as the absolute worst part of any video game. There is nothing fun about babysitting a defenseless AI companion who actively wants to walk directly into the line of fire. When we found out the entire premise of Resident Evil 4 was rescuing the president's daughter and dragging her back out of hostile territory, there was a collective heavy sigh. And then we actually met Ashley Graham. She quickly became the poster child of why escort missions induce so much anxiety. The sheer ear-piercing trauma of hearing "Leon, help!" screamed at the top of her lungs every 5 seconds is permanently burnt into the brains of anyone who played this game. If she wasn't crouching directly in front of your laser sight while you were trying to snipe a cultist, she was getting scooped up and carried off over the shoulder by a random villager, resulting in an instant game over. You had to manage her health, manage her positioning, and constantly waste precious green herbs just to keep her standing. But Capcom knew exactly how annoying this dynamic was going to be, and they actually built a brilliant mechanical pressure valve right into the environments to deal with it. The absolute comedic relief of finding a rusted, foul-smelling metal trash bin and realising you could command the daughter of the President of the United States to climb inside and shut the lid is unmatched. It became the ultimate strategy. The second a room looked even slightly dangerous, you didn't try to protect her. You immediately found a dumpster, shoved it inside, and told her to stay put. It was hilarious, but it completely fixed the core problem of the escort genre by giving you simple wait and follow commands, along with dedicated environmental hiding spots. The game actually gave you control. You could lock Ashley away in a metal box, pull out your shotgun, and go to work suplexing cultists in absolute peace without constantly checking over your shoulder. When the room was finally clear of granados and the dust had settled, you just walked back over, whistled, and the lid popped open. As utterly grating as her voice was, the game gave you the exact tools you needed to mitigate the frustration, turning what should have been a game-ruining escort mission into a genuinely manageable and highly memeable mechanic.
Ashley! Where are ya?
Leon!
Come on. Let's go home.
Sounds like a great idea. Mission accomplished. Right, Leon?
Not quite. I still have to get you home safe.
So, after you take me back to my place, how about we do some, overtime?
Sorry.
Somehow I knew you'd say that, but it doesn't hurt to ask, you know? So, who was that woman anyway?
Why do you ask?
Come on, tell me.
She's like a part of me I can't let go. Let's leave it at that.
The pacing of Resident Evil 4 is a masterclass in boiling a frog. When you start in that dreary, washed-out village, the threat feels relatively grounded. You are fighting off grimy locals, wielding pitchforks and the occasional rusty chainsaw. The horror is palpable because it feels raw, isolated and desperate. But Capcom slowly turns the dial up chapter by chapter until you suddenly realise you are playing an entirely different genre of video game. By the time you leave the village and cross the drawbridge into Raymond Salazar's castle, the grounded rural horror starts slipping away. The transition is subtle at first, but suddenly you are dodging flaming catapults manned by chanting cultists in red robes. You are navigating trapdoors, fighting blind gladiators with massive Wolverine claws in locked cages, and actively running away from a giant mechanical fire-breathing statue of a tiny Spanish aristocrat that is literally chasing you down a crumbling stone bridge like something out of an Indiana Jones. It is completely absurd, but the game is so relentlessly confident in its execution that you just accept it and keep pulling the trigger. Then you hit the island. Any lingering illusion that this is still a traditional survival horror game completely evaporates the second a Granado named JJ steps out from behind the corner, revving a massive multi-barrel Gatling gun. The final third of the game is pure, unadulterated Michael Bay chaos. You are infiltrating heavily armed military complexes, driving through laser grids, fighting mutated super soldiers in hanging shipping containers, and engaging in heavily choreographed knife fights with your former comrades. The muddy, claustrophobic dread of the opening hours is completely replaced by roaring explosions and actual helicopter air support. To be fair to Capcom, they did throw in the Regenerators right in the middle of this action movie climax to prove they hadn't forgot how to do horror. Hearing that heavy, raspy, unnatural breathing echoing through a sterile medical facility, desperately trying to equip the thermal scope to shoot the parasites hidden inside their rubbery bodies, is easily one of the most terrifying spikes of dread in the entire franchise. But those moments were the exception, not the rule. The overarching momentum was pushing heavily towards the outright warfare. It is an absolutely wild trajectory. You start the game carefully counting handgun bullets in a dilapidated wooden shack, and you end it escaping an exploding island facility on a jet ski with the president's daughter. The sheer variety of set pieces prevents the lengthy campaign from ever feeling stale, constantly throwing new, ridiculous obstacles at you to keep the adrenaline pumping. But looking back from that massive shift from pitchforks to Gatling guns, it becomes incredibly obvious exactly where the franchise was destined to go next.
Thanks. When we get out of here, drinks are on me.
Yeah, hey, I know a good bar.
I'll make sure you're the next to go, Sadler.
It is a strange thing to look back at one of the greatest video games ever made and realise it essentially broke the franchise. Resident Evil 4 is undeniably a masterpiece, a perfect storm of game design that managed to catch the absolute lightning in a bottle. Shinji Mikami walked an incredible fine razor-sharp line between heart-pounding action and genuine survival horror. For every Gatling gun or exploding helicopter, there was a pitch-black corridor with a regenerator waiting at the end of it. The game knew exactly when to make you feel like an unstoppable action hero, and exactly when to rip that power away and leave you desperately counting your last few shotgun shells. But the problem with catching lightning in a bottle is that it's almost impossible to do twice. When Capcom looked at the staggering critical and commercial success of this game, they didn't seem to learn the right lessons. They didn't see a carefully balanced masterclass in pacing. They just saw the massive sales numbers, the explosive set pieces, the suplexes, and the massive mainstream appeal of the modern shooter market. The over-the-shoulder revolution didn't just change Resident Evil, it changed the entire gaming industry. Suddenly, every third-person game on the market was trying to copy Leon's laser-sighted combat loop, and the unique, isolated identity of survival horror was completely diluted into a sea of generic action shooters. Resident Evil 4 proved that high-octane action sold infinitely better than slow, methodical horror, and that realisation was the exact catalyst that sent the series wildly off course. The delicate balance achieved here was completely abandoned in the sequels. Instead of refining the horror, Capcom just tuned the action dial up to 11 and ripped the knob off. The creeping rural dread of the Spanish village directly paved the way for Chris Redfield physically punching a boulder inside an active volcano in Resident Evil 5, and that, in turn, mutated into the absolute chaotic bloated warfare of Resident Evil 6. We got what we needed, an evolution of the franchise that saved it from completely stagnating in the early 2000s, but the cost was immense. By wiping the board clean and leaning so heavily into blockbuster adrenaline, Resident Evil 4 inadvertently killed the very genre it helped define. It would take over a decade and a desperate return to the claustrophobic roots with Resident Evil 7 before the franchise finally remembered how to actually scare us again.
Hunnigan, is that you?
Finally, the line's jack-free.
Hey, Hunnigan, no glasses.
Forget the glasses. What's the status of the mission?
I've rescued the subject. We're returning home.
You did it, Leon.
Thanks. You know, you're kind of cute without those glasses. Give me your number when I get back.
May I remind you that you're still on duty.
Story of my life.
At the end of the day, Resident Evil 4 is a massive, complicated masterpiece. Flawed not in its execution, because mechanically, it is undeniably one of the tightest, most revolutionary action games ever coded, but complicated in what it meant for the overarching identity of the franchise. It took a massive risk. wiped the board entirely clean, completely redefined third-person shooters, and gave us some of the most addictive adrenaline-fueled gameplay of the entire console generation, but in doing so, it left the creeping dread of true survival horror completely in the dust. It was the definitive end of an era. The pre-rendered backgrounds, the restrictive tank controls, the dramatic fixed camera angles, and the slow, shuffling zombies were officially a thing of the past. We had fully transitioned out of the classic style and firmly planted our boots into the high-octane blockbuster territory. Before your attaché case completely fills up and you're forced to eat a raw brown egg just to make room for a flash grenade, make sure you hit that subscribe button, drop a comment below, and let me know if you genuinely missed the classic zombies or if the pitchfork-wielding Grenados completely won you over. And hit the like button before the merchant packs up his blue torches for good. As we look towards the future of the series and the inevitable escalation of all this action, Capcom decided to give everyone absolute whiplash. Instead of immediately pushing forward, their actual next release took us all the way back to 1996. We are trading the home consoles for the dual screen handheld, and we are heading right back into the Spencer Mansion for a bizarre, bite-sized port. It is time to talk about Resident Evil Deadly Silence. I'll see you on the next one.
No thanks, bro.
My.